All right, good morning again. Sorry that I had to miss that. I'm sure that I heard the presentation already, so I'm sure that Willis was pretty good. Before I left, I did not have the opportunity to thank AC, who dropped on the spot and danced. Those that saw that, give him a round of applause. At this particular time, we have the introducers. Jordan Cuffey will come up, and she will introduce Miss Joan Morgan, and then we'll just go from there. Jordan Cuffey.
Good morning, everybody. Joan Morgan is the author and cultural critic who coined the phrase hip-hop feminism with the publication of the best-selling When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, My Life as a Hip-Hop Feminist. Since she published the book in 1999, Morgan has been a widely sought-after lecturer and commentator on hip-hop and feminism. An award-winning journalist, a provocative cultural critic, and a self-confessed hip-hop junkie, she began her professional writing career freelancing for The Village Voice before having her work published by Vibe, Madison, Interview, MS, More, Spin, and numerous others. Formerly the executive editor of Essence, she's taught hip-hop journalism at Duke University and has been a visiting scholar at Vanderbilt University. In January of 2013, she was a visiting lecturer at Stanford University's Institute for the Diversity of the Arts, where she taught the course, The Pleasure Principle, a post-hip-hop search for a Black feminist politics of pleasure. Morgan is currently pursuing her doctorate as a McCracken Fellow enrolled in the American Studies program at New York University. So without further ado, I present to you all Joan Morgan.
Good morning. Today I'll be introducing to you all Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. Dr. Mark Anthony Neal is a professor of Black popular culture in the Department of African American and African American Studies at Duke University, where he won the 2010 Robert B. Cox Award for Teaching. Neal has written and lectured extensively on Black popular culture, Black masculinity, sexism, and homophobia in Black communities, and history of the popular music. He is the author of What the Music Said, The Black Popular Music and Black Popular Culture of 1998, Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture and the Post-Soul of 2002, Songs in the Keys of Black Life, A Rhythm and Blues Nation of 2003, and New Black Man, Rethinking Black Masculinity in 2005. Neal is the co-editor with Murray Foreman of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader's Second Edition, 2011, Looking for Leroy, 2013 is his latest book. Neal hosts the weekly webcast Left in the Black in collaboration with John Hopkins Franklin Center at Duke University. A frequently commentator for National Public Radio, Neal contributes to several online media outlets, including HuffPost Black Voice, Ebony.com, SeenBlack.com, and Britain News Black magazine. He has also appeared in several documentaries, including Brian Hurt's acclaimed Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, 2006, Urban Soul in 2004, and Jonathan Gale's White Scripts and Black Superman, 2012. I present to you none other than Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. Thank you.
So as the beginning of an introduction, if you see Joan and I sitting here like this right now, we first sat next to each other like this somewhere around 1968, 1969. We would have been 3 years old. It would have been a stoop in front of the building 1231 Fulton Avenue in the South Bronx. There was no hip hop in the world yet. Kool Herc would have come to the Bronx from Jamaica around the same time that Joan got to the Bronx from Jamaica. We were the children of two working class families. In Joan's case, immigrants. In my case, newly New York-centered migrants from Georgia and Maryland, by way of North Carolina. Our mothers in particular had big dreams for us, which meant that they were going to control what our social circle was. And they decided that the two of us were going to be friends. And that's basically how it has played out for more than 45 years now.
So we lived, can you guys hear me? I don't know if this is on. Can you guys hear me? So we lived in the same building, basically. I lived on the first floor. Mark lived on the third floor and fifth floors at different points. And so our friendship was very much contained and partially prescribed and convenient. It's funny because I remember when people started to, people knew that Mark and I knew each other, but they had no idea that we knew each other for as long as we did. Like, Mark was my very first friend, not my first male friend, my first, my first best friend in the world. And I don't really know, I don't know if you really had much to say about it. I think I just kind of decided that Mark was going to be my friend. I was incredibly territorial and possessive, but it's not an understatement to say that I pretty much tried to spend any of my free sort of playtime with Mark from a very small age. It's funny to me now that I still try to spend a great deal of my intellectual free slash playtime with Mark. He's still the person that I call to go, hey, I have this crazy idea, and what do you think? And then, okay, well, how do we make it happen, and how do we put it into play? And it's a very interesting thing because I remember us sitting on the stoop and playing these very imagination-based games. Like, Mark used to love trains, and so he would be the conductor, and I would yell out stops of the different places that we would go visit. So the fact that this friendship is one that is based really on planes, trains, and automobiles. Like, Mark and I never see each other. It's rare when we see each other at home, actually. Right. It's always usually on the road. You don't realize at 3 how much of a template you're building for a relationship, a friendship that's lasted 47 years at this point.
So to put this in the context for which we're here today, we grew up in the South Bronx. We would have grown up in the South Bronx at a time where no one would say, oh, that's hip hop. It just was what it was. It was what was playing in the park. It was what was down the block. It's what we wanted to be part of as young black kids growing up in the Bronx with no idea not only that this would become a multi-billion-dollar industry, but that we would eventually make careers in the arts and letters talking about hip-hop.
Yeah, I still, I remember in 1997, I became one of the first staff writers for a magazine called Vibe. Do you guys know Vibe magazine? So Vibe was a really exciting thing. Like, it wasn't, the source had certainly preceded us, and hip hop was certainly getting national coverage. But Quincy Jones wanted a magazine that talked specifically about, looked at America through the lens specifically of hip hop culture, which gave us kind of free rein to make what we did really broad. We could talk about fashion, we could talk about film, we could talk about hip hop, certainly, but we could talk about it through the lens of like culture. And so no one in that audience and no one in that office was, everyone was under 30, including the CEO. It was a really crazy time. For some of us, it was like our first real jobs. We had been freelancing before that. And I remember closing the door to my office and spinning around in my chair and be like, I have a job based on hip hop. Like what? You know what I mean? Like you didn't go to college to major in that. You know what I mean? For a long time, my family was sort of like, well, what are you doing with your life? I don't understand this hip hop thing at all, as all good Jamaican immigrant parents, first generation do. It's like, you're not going to law school? What do you mean you're doing this writing thing? And like, my job was to basically go out and cover hip hop culture, which, I mean, I'm gonna be really honest, Mark, I just kind of waited, I was really always waiting for like the other shoe to drop. Like, okay, this is a fluke. When is it all gonna be up? Like, when is it gonna be like the next thing? Because I don't think any of us knew that hip hop was gonna last that long.
Yeah.
You know, not 40 years.
No, not at all. You know, one of the running jokes we tell people about our relationship, have you ever seen the film Brown Sugar? You know, we're brown sugar without the romance. Just had to add that particular caveat to it. So in the spirit of that moment, I'm going to ask you the question from Brown Sugar. You know, when did you fall in love with hip hop?
When did I fall in love with hip hop? I don't have a moment like that, because hip hop was always there. You know what I mean? I remember sneaking out and getting into a lot of trouble, like telling my family I was someplace else and sneaking out to Boston Road to go hear, like, well, he was Kid Flash then, and he was trying to, Grandmaster Flash was Kid Flash then, and he was trying to be an MC, which was not a good thing. He's a much better DJ. But I mean, I remember sneaking out and taking the tape recorder and trying to make like tapes of what was happening in the park. It just is kind of where you were and what you did. And I always considered it mine, because hip hop hadn't started to travel, so it was like in my mind, a very Bronx thing. Mm-hmm. It's much clearer for me, like, when is the moment where hip hop, I started to fall out of love with hip hop is actually a much clearer, and I can pinpoint that's NWA 1988, where I'm like, okay, now we got a problem. But I think I just don't remember it not being there.
I just came about the fact that, and we talked about this a little earlier, I mean, there was no name for it.
Right.
You know, it wasn't something that you could say that's what it is. It was no different than some of the ghetto games that we played. Skellies, Roundup. I mean, any of that stuff. It was
Ring-a-levia.
Ring-a-levia. It's just the stuff that we did. And for me, it's literally the park, right? I'm like Nas looking out the project window out to the park, and I lived in a project that's called Throgs Neck, which is literally a stone's throw from Bronx River, and everything was happening over in Bronx River in terms of folks like Africa Bambaataa and those kinds of folks. It was a dude that I played sandlot baseball with, Ike C., who was the first person in our neighborhood to kind of grow up when he became part of Zulu Nation, and it just was what it was. And at that point, we all wanted to be something. I think my name was MC Tony T. I never got on the mic live because I wasn't good. But the idea of belonging to a crew, I think the crew was called Disco One. And so just the idea of belonging to all of that, right? And I knew I was never going to go deeply into it because my mom wasn't having it. Right, I wasn't going to be in the park after dark, and as far as my parents were concerned, with that damn noise outside, I just wasn't going to be a part of that. So I think, for me, at least in the early days, it was almost kind of living vicariously around that.
Well, I mean, think something definitely happened, right? Because we went from hip hop just sort of being there and taking it for granted to realizing that. It became our work. Yeah. So for you, when was that moment? When did you realize you wanted to make hip hop like part of your work? Because it's not as if like you went to college and there were a ton of hip hop courses, and like you guys have to understand, there were no books. Like the books that exist, we wrote them. That you guys are reading now, we wrote them. So there were no books. You couldn't major in hip, like there wasn't any of that.
There's no Google.
Right, so it's not as if like we were academically trained to kind of do what we do. We sort of had to make it, you know?
There was no cable television in the hood. So as much as you can complain about BET, you couldn't even have that. Radio stations in big cities like New York wouldn't play hip hop till after midnight. So you couldn't hear it during the day. I mean, you had to stay up late, you know, and if you were up late, you were probably in a club, so you're not sitting in your house, you know, listening to the radio. So Joan is right. I mean, there was nothing out there, and you know, as a writer, I came of age thinking about being a writer in the late '80s, reading a bunch of writers at a newspaper, a weekly newspaper called The Village Voice, where Joan also was a writer, and reading folks like Nelson George, who had also read in Billboard when he was there, in particular reading a guy like Greg Tate. And it was really literally a piece that Joan wrote about Ice Cube's America's Most Wanted. And it's like yesterday, I'm walking from the train station home, unemployed, as it was at the time, and opening up the Village Voice to see what was going on. And I saw her byline in this piece on Ice Cube. And I remember reading it from the time I got from the train station till I got home. And it was like, okay, this is the that I want to do.
But why? What was it about that piece?
It was, first of all, was your voice, right? And how connected your voice was to framing this kind of moment, right? And, you know, we're New York folks, right? So I was never feeling NWA.
Well, you should tell them a little bit about the piece.
So, you know, it's a review of Ice Cube's solo album. And of course, if you know about Ice Cube's trajectory, Ice Cube made an incredible decision at a very young age that his deal with NWA would not be a good deal for him or his career. So at 19 years old, after he had virtually written all the songs on Straight Outta Compton, right, because he was the lyricist, he and MC Ren, he walked away from NWA, decided to go solo.
College. He also
and college, right, because this is the other thing you don't know about Cube. You know, Cube wanted to be an architect. And if you go and Google, there's this incredible interview with Ice Cube from about 3 years ago, where he does a tour of the Eames house. And the Eames were this couple, and they did some interesting architectural stuff. And it's a video about his critique of the Eames architectural style, right? So this is someone who, and again, with all these guys, these are middle-class kids, lower middle-class kids, two-parent households, right, who, like all of us, got drawn to hip-hop. But, you know, he breaks away from NWA, comes to New York, and gets produced by the Bomb Squad. And of course, the Bomb Squad is a production crew that's producing all the Public Enemy songs. So, you know, that first Ice Cube album is like a West Coast Public Enemy. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I remember her talking about, you know, writing the pieces like, you know, this is like some warrior music, right? And she's writing about driving up to Martha's Vineyard with her girls, right? Because we're all first generation college students. We just got out of college. We're feeling all of this possibility, right? It's 89, it's 90. You know, 1989, Heavy D releases a song called, you know, We Got Our Own Thing. And I always thought that was like the theme song for our generation, right? This is our own. This is our moment. You got Heavy, you know, talking about we got our own thing. We got Soul to Soul coming from Britain talking about keep on moving. So it was a very promising and inspirational moment, right? So when I read Joan's piece, it's like, yes, this is that I want to do. But I also intuitively knew that I wouldn't do it as a journalist, right? I wanted to bring that energy into the academy, right? So I ended up going back to school, and, you know, it's funny because back in these days, it's like, you know, I wanted to write a dissertation on hip hop, and folks are like, what the hell are you talking about? Yeah. And even as you're trying to write the work, you realize you're going to have to teach the academy about what the hell the work is. Right. You know, Trisha's book, you know, I started graduate school in 1991. Trisha Rose's book, Black Noise, and she writes what's technically the first dissertation in hip hop. Trisha's book doesn't come out till 1994. There's a book called Rap Attack. There's 2 versions of it. Now there's 3 from David Toop. And that was the first book you could actually read that talked anything about hip hop. There was this guy by the name of John Michael Spencer who edited this book on black religious music. And it becomes one of the first scholarly books that actually addresses hip hop in some sort of significant way. Michael Eric Dyson's not in the academy yet, so he's writing for a magazine called Z Magazine, and he's doing the stuff that he's doing. All of this stuff is brand new, right? And so we're literally, as journalists and as scholars, creating a field, building a field, right, in which we can actually sit and talk about is foundational now. The fact that there's a hip-hop archive at Harvard, that there's a hip-hop archive at Cornell, that there's a hip-hop archive at William and Mary, So it was a very, very different moment, right? And I think all of us felt the freedom of being able to shape a world. And then Rodney King happens. And folks need folks to connect the dots, right? When LA blows up in 1992, right? And of course, on the New York side, we have been witnessing this since Yusef Hawkins in 1989 and Eleanor Bumpurs in 1985. When the Rodney King moment happens, in response to his beating in 91 and LA blows up in 92, suddenly all the mainstream press is like, well, what is this hip hop thing, right? What is this noise, right? And we all became relevant.
Right. So that piece that Mark is talking about, that's what's interesting for me about that Ice Cube piece, there are a couple of things that I remember about it. One was that I really did not want to write it. It was probably my third piece of, it was my third music piece. So I had no intention ever of being, one, I had no intention of being a journalist. That kind of just happened. But certainly being a music journalist was never anything I planned to do. And I just didn't really, first of all, it was so masculine and kind of testosterone-y at that point, so you had like these guys writing about rock and roll, and you had these guys writing about hip hop, and it was all very, in addition to the testosterone, it was all very sort of like music geek language, like, a booming thrash riff with a blah, 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 blah. And I just didn't understand what that really had to do with anything or why it was relevant, or do people actually read these and go out and buy music or not buy music? So it wasn't a genre I wanted to do and have anything to do with. And then I was sitting in the Village Voice with all the real staff writers, and the music editor came over and handed me a cassette. It was a cassette at that point.
Who was the music editor?
Joe Levy, who's now the head honcho at Rolling Stone, and said to me, "Joan, we need you to do a review." And I was like, a music review? I was like, all the music, I'm sitting with all the music review guys, like, let them do it. And he said, no, this one needs you. There's this girl out of Jersey, out of Newark, called Queen Latifah, and I think you need to hear this. Still wasn't completely sold. I was like, I don't really do music journalism. And he said, not only are you the only woman sitting in this office, at the time I was, you're the only one here who legitimately grew up with hip hop. Like, if not you, who else should do this piece? So he framed it that way, and I did it. And that began my career, my reluctant career as a music writer. The second piece I did was a profile of Moni Love. So mind you, I've come into journalism with no journalistic training at all. I didn't go to journalism school. I've never taken a journalism class. Everything I did, I basically said yes first, and then I just figured out how to do it. So hip hop. So it's a profile on Moni Love, who, like Queen Latifah, was part of Native Tongue, and she was great, but I didn't even really know what a profile was. I didn't know what a lead was. I just kept asking the guys, like, okay, so what's a lead, and what does a lead have to do? A lead is like your intro in a music piece. And so I just I interviewed her, but I assumed it was how you did an interview. I didn't know how you did an interview. Transcribed it, boom, there's a piece. So this third thing now I'm like the chick music writer at the Village Voice. There are other women writing about music. I'm the only woman writing about hip hop, per se, at the Village Voice. and my music editor gives me this Ice Cube piece to review, and I'm like, I don't want to do it for multiple reasons. One is, as I said before, I started to, the moment I started like to think that hip hop and I might have to break up was when NWA released Straight Outta Compton. It was the first time, it's not that there hadn't been misogyny in hip hop before, but it was more virulent on this album than I had ever heard before in my history of like engaging hip hop. So, and it was pretty, it was kind of emblematic of what people considered the genre of West Coast rap, otherwise known as gangster rap. And I was like, yeah, I don't know how to get down on the West Coast. I ain't been to LA. That's just not, I'm like, nah. And then, art imitates life, life imitates art, and Dr. Dre beats the hell out of like D Barnes in a ladies' room. So this, to me, starts to suggest that hip hop, my long-term hip hop with love with hip hop, that we're entering the danger zone. Like we need counseling. Like there's a breakup might possibly be imminent. And I'm also, I got dubbed a feminist writer very early at the Village Voice, actually with my first piece. I was listed as a black feminist writer on the cover long before I had even decided I was a feminist. So I was already working out how to deal with that identity. I was like writing about this clearly misogynist music as a feminist writer is going to be a problem. Like, one, I don't want to spend the time with it, but two, more importantly, I don't want to have to spend the time justifying why I would choose to write about it. Plus, I was on my way out to Martha's Vineyard. It was like vacation time. And I was like, really, do I want to spend, because when you do music reviews, it's up in your ear, in your head like this. So there's the experience of seeing how the music circulates through the economy of community or the club and feeling it and experiencing, but the review is like up under your head like this. I was like, I'm trying to go sit on the gazebo, hang out at the inkwell, be at the beach like all the other good bougie black people, first generation. And so it was the first time, however, in a music piece that I was being asked to have these kind of disparate parts of my life add up. And I just didn't know how to do it. I was like, am I writing as Joan the hip hop head? Am I writing as Joan, who went to private school in Wesleyan, is headed out to like Martha's Vineyard for the weekend in the 80s? And am I writing as, with a hardcore love for East Coast rap? Am I defending East Coast rap? Am I positing this versus West Coast rap? And then here's the horror. I actually really like the album. Like, the production is sick. It's straight like East Coast production, right? Yeah. And because Cube has this very sort of percussive, gnarly, kind of ominous, dangerous quality to his rhyme style. It's a perfect marriage. I mean, the is like seamless, right? And so I'm like, no, the horror. And then, somewhere in the middle of the trip, I'm like singing all the lyrics. And I'm kind of horrified with myself, quite frankly. And so I had to make a decision and reconcile in that piece, how was I going to deal with being not only a feminist, but a very public feminist, but publicly a feminist, because we didn't have public intellectuals back then, but a public feminist who was really like immersed in hip hop culture. How was I gonna work that out? So that became like, the equivalent of that in the academy is like figuring out what your thesis is. What's your dissertation gonna be? What's your long-term project is? How am I gonna reconcile this tension of being a woman, being a feminist black woman, and writing about hip hop culture? And so the piece is really, the piece, even the form and structure of it, doesn't look like a regular music review. It's actually more like a screenplay of different scenes and shots in places that, for as diverse as Martha's Vineyard to like Harlem in 1988, which is not the Harlem of now. at all. No, 1990? Is this 1990? 1990. And also Mandela is walking out of Robben's Island at the time. So historically, there's all this stuff to try to deal with. You know, the album in some ways sounds like, okay, black people, this is why we can't have nice things. It sounds like the end of, it can easily be read as everything negative about black youth culture come to fruition. And yet it's a time of incredible artistic and political promise. And how do we knit all of that together? So that became the Ice Cube piece. But when I look back on it, it is absolutely the template for what later became hip hop feminism.
That 2 months earlier, Fear of a Black Planet comes out. So Fear of a Black Planet and America's Most Wanted are 25 years old this year. The Fresh Prince from Bel Air debuted in January of 1990. New Jack City. Well, that's a year later. But all this stuff is popping
Which
off.
I actually auditioned for. Did you know that?
I did not know.
Yeah, I did. With Mario Van Peebles
For which role?
Jr. I read for the Ivy League educated ride or die homegirl.
Yeah.
And then another chick that I don't remember. But the other chick, like went in to read for them, and then the other chick was like straight hood, and they were like, let's have you read for that one too.
Well, that's another interesting point that you raised, because it was a small community, right? There's an iconic photo that a bunch of folks did, probably 1989, with Spike and Nelson and Vernon Reed, who was the founder of the group Living Color, and
Chris Rock.
It's
Fort Greene, basically, Fort Greene,
yeah.
Brooklyn.
And so what you had, coming out of Brooklyn this time, was this nice little community of black artsy-fartsy types.
Okay, I just want to say that it's called The New Black Aesthetic, and Trey Ellis lives on 81st and Riverside Drive, and is about as upper middle class black as you can get. So I just want to say that historically, these things take on, in order to package them, take on these things that lose nuance. So no, it was not all going. I lived in Harlem. It was not all going down in Brooklyn. I just want to say that.
But you mentioned about that piece about trying to reconcile these tensions, because I've long said holding hip-hop accountable is the easy part. Holding hip-hop accountable when you love it is the more difficult part, right? And a whole bunch of folks in hold hip-hop accountable who have no investment in hip-hop, right? If you actually have an investment in it, right, both in terms of what it's meant for us, right? Because the thing about hip-hop that I think people miss, and I know white people miss, because it gets all reduced to what you hear on the radio, but it's so much more expansive, right? You can't have a hip hop feminism without hip hop, right? But at the same time, hip hop produces this distinct critique of gender and sexuality within our communities that might not exist in the absence of hip hop, right? That now takes on a whole different kind of element, because one of the pieces that Joan writes after she's been dubbed the hip hop feminist, she gets asked to cover the Mike Tyson rape trial, right? And this is the moment where, those of us who've been cutting our teeth in hip hop begin to have a broader view of the world using the tools that we had generated, the critical sensibilities that we had generated, writing and thinking about hip hop.
Yeah, I mean, journalistically speaking, what's starting to happen, so hip hop used to get really crappy coverage in mainstream. And then even when it did get coverage, it tended to be coverage it was the people who were doing music journalism, which is mostly male, predominantly white male. And so a lot of the early coverage of hip hop is written by these white men who were geeky kind of fans in a way, but completely removed from the culture, knew nothing about the hood, knew nothing about where the music was produced, really didn't even know the culture of the people that they were writing about. And so there were just a group of us who were like, yo, that's whack. You would get a better response if you sat us down with these folk, because we're actually part of the same community. They're in audiences while we're all going to the same parties. We're all going to the same crappy venues waiting for the other acts to be done so you can hear your hip hop act start at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And we're part of a community. So so editors start to realize they have an access that other people don't really have, but they also have a perspective on culture not just hip hop culture, but the culture of of youth culture, of particularly Black and Latino, of color culture that no one else really seems to be able to write about that way. And frankly, we don't want to give up the real estate for in a magazine, because articles are considered valuable real estate. But if they can sneak that culture in, writing around like, Ice Cube, like, I'm happy with that, because I can justify giving the space up to Ice Cube. I don't know that I can justify giving up like column space or anything else. So really what we didn't understand, which we definitely know now, is that we were practicing a form of cultural criticism, and actually kind of contributing to a template for a critique of Black popular culture that married really well with what Michelle Wallace was doing, and Greg Tate was doing, and Lisa Jones was doing, and a whole bunch of other folk at the time. So there is this really strong, burgeoning Black arts movement that is very much taking place throughout New York City at that time, that's also happening with the rise of hip hop. So there is this very interesting kind of Black artist intellectual culture that is very protective of hip hop and wants to critique it, but also wants to make sure that the critique is always infused from the perspective of like, not only do I love this, but it's part of who I am. Right. Yeah.
So why the Academy now?
Me?
Yes, you. Right, so this has come full circle. Right? And, Joan and I have had many conversations over the last decade. We were fortunate, particularly for 2 or 3 really solid years. Bakari Kitwana, who's the author of Hip Hop Generation and Why White Kids Love Hip Hop, a former editor at The Source, also a former editor at Hakeem Mahboudi's Third World Press. And so he's put together a traveling town hall that's almost a decade old now, called Rap Sessions. So we are fortunate, for 2 or 3 years to do 5, 6, 7, 8 dates a year, traveling with folks like the visual artist John Jennings, the filmmaker Byron Hurt, scholar Tracy Sharpley Whiting. I mean, just a whole kind of range of folks. And one of the discussions we would get in all the time, arguments sometimes, were about how journalists write about hip hop and how the Academy writes about hip hop. And particularly folks in the Academy who just get shit wrong in ways that would never be allowed to
But
go
like,
down.
I mean, like really wrong, like Skip Gates writing even now that Tupac was in Digital Underground. Like, what? Like, that's just a fact check, dude. Okay.
So those kind of things, right? And so with her critique of all of this, the irony is that, she finds herself entering a doctoral program in NYU, in some ways having to now be a part of the very kind of community that she had been so suspect of. But talk about what that means, and it's not just you, right? You think about someone like Scott Folsom Bryant, who's also part of that first generation of young Black writers, at the Village Voice. I mean, it's, on the one hand, it's about the shift of the journalistic world where you can't be a working journalist anymore, right? You can't afford to live and be a working journalist. So I think it's fairly natural that we see, some of the more freelance artist types kind of flowing over now to the Academy. But what makes that different now, than it was, say, 20 years ago when you were so suspect of it?
Okay, so really, I had absolutely no intentions ever of setting my foot back into school once I'd finished. I mean, I couldn't even make it to law school, which was the deal that I had promised my parents after I finished Wesleyan, that I would take a year off and go to law school. And honestly, I was one of those kind of students at Wesleyan that did really, really well in the courses that I cared about, and in the ones that I didn't, But what I didn't realize, and I took completely for granted, is that in terms of how the Academy looks at things, I was being quote unquote trained by some really lead scholars. So, I was trained, I took courses with Hazel Carby, I took courses with Bob O'Meally, I took courses with Jerry Watch, which are these premier Black intellectual scholars and thinkers, but I just took it for granted. What I didn't really understand is that I was taking what the Academy calls all that training, and that was really the critical analysis that I was able to bring to music journalism that seems so unique. So that separation, the way that I thought of it as separate, really was never that separate. Second of all, I wrote my book, Chicken Heads, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost. I wrote it to be deliberately anti-Academy. I just was like, I need a book about feminism, and I definitely want to write about hip hop and feminism, but I need to write this for homegirls that are not going to pick up bell hooks or Angela Davis, that are never ever going to sit in, the sort of ivy tower of academia, and that's not where their Black feminism is going to come from. It's not really where mine came from, even though I was lucky enough to be exposed to those books, but I just never found my particular voice there. So, there's some things about Chicken Heads that are actually really quite deliberate that people don't understand. I'm always very thrilled when people tell me that they read it in like 2.5 days, because at the time, Terry McMillan was like the lead Black female author of what's known as chick lit. And I was like, well, suppose I can do a book that's deeply critical, but you want to curl up with it the way that you like curl up with chick lit. I wanted it to sound like you were having these conversations with your girlfriends and your homegirls, not necessarily like something that you were going to pick up in class and have these sort of very heavy theoretical conversations about. Like, not only was I anti-theory, but I didn't really know theory, and so I wasn't even really, it wasn't going to come from that place. So even though I'm trying to do this kind of anti-academic thing, the place where hip-hop picks up the most traction is ironically where? In the Academy. So at the point that I decide to enter the Academy, hip-hop is, that book has been being taught now for 10 years. So that was an interesting tension, because as much as I was critical of hip-hop in the Academy, I am part of hip-hop in the Academy, whether I wanted to be or not. But I went to grad school so I could stop talking about hip-hop and feminism. Actually, I was sort of burnt out. I felt that I had said everything that I needed to say, and I was like, well, maybe if I go get a doctorate in like something completely unrelated, people will stop asking me to talk about that, which just hasn't happened. I still have very strong critiques of the Academy. I do feel that the work that we start to see now about hip hop that's coming out of the Academy will be better and stronger, because you have advisors who, you actually have a generation of scholars who've written their own books. There is actually good scholarly work, and that these people can serve as committee members and chair members. And so I feel very good about your generation sort of studying hip hop in the Academy. My project is not at all hip hop related, so I'm not contributing to that. But I also just have to say that I appreciate the way the Academy has sharpened my critical analysis. There are often times now where I will read pieces by fellow journalists and just being like, you didn't go harder, you know what I mean? But what about this or what about that? And so I actually think that the balance of being a journalist and being a scholar is a really good one. I have a commitment to just being accessible. I'm not a big fan of academic language. I'm certainly not a big fan of jargon. I do think that academic writing on the whole just needs to be a lot stronger. I cannot believe how many people can get through the Academy with a PhD and write a sentence that is 17 lines long. 17-line long sentence is a friggin' run-on, okay?
I like those sentences.
No, they're wrong. Like, you need better editors. If your sentence is 17 lines long, then the thought has not been thought out enough clearly for you to explain it to somebody that is not in the Academy. And that is the mark of teaching, not speaking to the 7 people who also understand and allow 17-line sentences, which is why my dissertation is probably going to take forever. But anyway.
So, thinking about hip hop in the Academy now, I'm at some place like Duke, and whatever Duke's reputation is, it's not the place that you would think there's a lot of hip hop going on. So for the last 5 years, I've been co-teaching a class with Ninth Wonder. Ninth Wonder, founding member of Little Brother, Ninth Wonder who won a Grammy Award, Ninth Wonder who appeared on Jay-Z's The Black Album, Ninth Wonder who won a Grammy for producing Mary J. Blige, Ninth Wonder who has a label called Jamla, who has an artist named Rhapsody, who was the only female that was featured on Kendrick's To Pimp a Butterfly, right? It's been a really good semester. Rhapsody's come to class a couple of times. But anyway, we co-teach this class, 119 students. I look at a place like Rice in Houston, right, another elite institution. For 4 or 5 years, Bun B and Anthony Penn have been teaching classes on hip hop and religion. You go up to someplace like NYU with the Clive Davis School of Recording Technology, and Harry Wenger, who is a vice president at Universal Music. Harry actually has the best job, I think, in America. His job is to live in the archives of Universal Music. Universal Music controls the total catalog of Motown, Bob Marley. I could go on and on. So his job is to package little releases, for people to consume stuff and find stuff that no one's listened to. But he co-teaches a class on this semester on Sly Stone and Earth, Wind, and Fire. Parliament Funkadelic versus Earth, Wind, and Fire with Questlove. So we're seeing a different kind of world. I mean, folks are accepting of this. Universities and colleges love these classes because, right, they put butts in the seat. You're here at a conference at Albany State. One of your former administrators has dubbed himself the hip-hop president, as a president of Dillard University. It's been like this total and different, incredible shift. I think one of the things that we worry about as working cultural critics, as scholars, are those kind of tools of the trade, right? Everything's been kind of democratized now because of social media and online platforms. We joke all the time. You watch an episode of Scandal or something else happens, and there's going to be 500 thought pieces that are going to be produced on somebody's blog the next day. None of them edited, most of them badly written. I can deal with the badly written if it's actually thought out, but badly thought out. And part of our challenge as we do this work in the academy is actually to pass on the skills to your generation on how to do this work well. Part of that means is that if you're going to write something, you actually have to be immersed in what's being written. If Spike Lee comes out with a film tomorrow that you review, can you review that film without actually knowing something about Spike Lee's body of work? If you're going to review Kendrick, can you really review a Kendrick album without listening to some Outkast? To figure out what kind of templates, is he basing his work? What is he responding? Because the work is always responding to something, right? What is it responding to? What is it speaking back to? And I think those kinds of things get lost, particularly as culture, particularly popular culture, and hip-hop in this case, has become so disposable, right? Everyone is trying to write to make sure that they have the first piece that's up. Right, that they get the most circulation, that they get the most eyeballs. And none of that stuff necessarily translate into good work. When everybody was running around trying to write a review of To Pimp a Butterfly, which I still have not written about, one of the things I said on Facebook is that there is someone who wrote a review of Miles Davis's Kinda Blue yesterday. Kinda Blue came out 55 years ago, right? But that's because the music itself was timeless, right? Do we think To Pimp a Butterfly is going to be timeless? Well, we don't know, right? And so why write about something that might, in fact, be disposable, right, as opposed to actually taking the time and engaging the work in some sort of significant way?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have a 16-year-old son, and so one of the things I've had to contend with is that he just... really, if I listen to any hip-hop, like he's sort of my hip-hop curator at this point, which is so funny because I spent so much of his life being his curator. Like, you can listen to this, this we're going to try to keep you away from as long as possible. But now he's my curator because he knows my tolerance level is extremely low. And so he's like, okay, Mom, you need to at least know this, given what you do, like to be even remotely relevant. But I also know that this is kind of what you can handle. But, you know, my son, who has definitely grown up with a base for hip-hop culture, just sort of seeing what the adults around him do, he's an MC, he writes rhymes, he spends time in the studio. You know, he's an actor who MCs, let me put it that way. It's very clear to me that even my son, who has a sort of kind of broad grasp of hip-hop as culture, is that you guys just experience the music very differently than we do. Like, for us, hip-hop was culture. It was also what your neighbor was doing, what was happening up the block, what the thing that you might be, you know, there might be somebody doing a beatbox on the corner. You guys experience hip-hop as a genre, basically, in pop culture. And so for whether or not you're immersed is simply about a decision of like, am I gonna listen to it or not listen to it? Am I gonna watch it or not watch it? It was literally all around us, which is a very different critical perspective to have to take, which makes the things that make good cultural criticism even more important. So this piece of art has not emerged out of nowhere. So what is the creative lineage that Kendrick is tapping into in order to produce music? What artists is he actually in conversation with? Where does this fit in terms of the current conversation that's going on in hip hop? But what is the back and forth between the new and the old that is happening, not just sonically or lyrically, but even in the production? And like, are people still sampling? Has sampling changed? What does that mean? There are all these great sort of critical questions that really can only be answered by your generation, but they still need the critical analysis that we laid the foundation for.
It's like when you listen to King Kunta. Listen to King Kunta and then put on James Brown's The Big Payback. And it's not about what's happening musically, but actually what Kendrick is doing with words, right? It's like a mirror image of some of the things that James Brown is doing on The Big Payback, right? But, you know, in between there is Mystical, right? And you know, you don't understand what Mystical's doing vocally unless you've heard James Brown, right? So it's those kind of piecing together. But, you know, the piece about us living with it, you know, hip-hop competes for your attention now because there's so many other things that are driving your attention. And there's a way that, you know, hip-hop has become white bread, you know, in that it's on a shelf with 27 other things, right? It was never that for us, right? You know, we were doting lovers of hip-hop, right? It didn't have to fight for our attention, which is why, you know, we live with the misogyny and the homophobia and the violence and all of that stuff because, you know, hip-hop was a giving lover, you know, for lack of a better way to describe it. You know, hip-hop is just a thing. So even when we use terms now like hip-hop generation, that is so not applicable to you, right? Because your world order isn't framed by hip-hop. But I think even for those of us who, you know, who've on multiple times tried to get off the bus, right? NWA wasn't that moment for me because I just wasn't listening to it. Right? You know, the moment that, you know, the shiny suit man showed up in the room. And I love the Shiny Suit Man's production because, you know, Puff know how to give a party. Ain't nobody never had a problem with that part of Puff. But when Puff picked up a mic and we were supposed to believe that, you know, there was something significant that was going to come out of his mouth that was supposed to be on par with Biggie, Tupac, Cool G Rap, you know, MC Light. I mean, we can go on.
You didn't like the Benjamins? It's all about the Benjamins.
Yeah, but that wasn't about him.
I'm teasing you.
I mean, even Kim, right? I mean, say what you want about Kim. Kim could spit. You know, Kim had bars. But that was my first moment getting it off, right? My second moment was 50 Cent, right? When your marketing plan, right? If you've seen the video for In the Club, right? And In the Club was brilliant, right? Because that's the other piece about hip-hop. There's a lot of complaints about what folks are doing lyrically, but in terms of the soundscape, in terms of the production, hip-hop production is as brilliant as it's ever been. We grew up in the 80s. We can't put on 10 80s songs and listen to them in a row because them tinny drum machines, it just doesn't work anymore. I mean, the quality of the production is it's hard to listen to. But, even with all that kind of stuff going on, it's a different kind of moment. And for you, it's it's just disposable. It's just.
Well, I'm off the bus, and I feel pretty good about that because I was on the bus for 10 years longer than I had planned to be on the bus.
I think we all were.
Even at 24. At 24, I was like...
Hell, even Jay-Z tried to get off the bus 15 years ago.
I think I'm off the bus. I'm really comfortable at this point letting other people have these conversations about hip-hop. I feel like I've always wanted to sort of be part of that moment that laid a foundation for good critical work. But I also think you age out of doing the work. I just do. I'm very suspect of critiques and reviews of hip-hop reviews by 49, 50-year-old people. And I think that there's reason for that. I think that your ear changes. I think your sort of sentimental attachment to the music that you came up with is what starts to shape your preferences in a way that it probably didn't when it was, at least in your 20s and 30s, you're aware that it's doing that. And I do think that it requires a particular openness of an ear so that you're not sort of going okay, this is whack, but because back in the day, this was, you know what I mean? We all have this sort of kind of attachment to whatever we think the golden age of hip hop is. And I'm I spent 20-something years of my life having to be up on the next. It's really nice, not having any kind of career obligation to be up on the next thing at all. If it happens to end up in my living room because my son just puts it right in front of me, that's fine.
In fact, we're going
but
back
I don't
in the
want to
opposite
chase
direction.
it. Yeah.
We're going back to the opposite direction.
Yeah, exactly. I had an Eagles lyric up on my Facebook page, which my son did not recognize as an Eagles lyric, mind the way, and thought I was talking about taking a road trip and giving up on my problems and finding an escapist lover. And he was like, I suggest you find your way into a car and get back home to your son. And I was like, it's a lyric, honey. It's a lyric. I really am not planning to throw all my cares away in Columbus, Ohio, and abandon you in New York. So that's me. A lot of people don't feel that way, but I do think that it's something people don't like to admit. I'll be 50 next month. There is no reason that I need to be writing about a 19-year-old producing hip hop at this point.
I had a student send me an email. Professor Neal, what you think about the new Big Sean? I don't care. That's in a nutshell, right? You care, you find a reason to tell us why it's important. Personally, I don't care, right? It's not an accident that I'm a Jay-Z stan. He gonna be 46 years old in December, right? He an old ass man, right? If you're an old ass man, you got some skill, I'm gonna listen to an old ass man. I ain't got no problem with that. Right? So the question that gets asked all the time, and we just did this in Columbus, Ohio. 5 tracks.
No, come
Yeah.
on.
Oh,
Mark.
come
I
on.
hated it in
Yeah.
Columbus.
Well, I know you hated it in Columbus. Yeah, but they don't know what your 5 tracks are. They don't know.
All right, but you want to up the ante and ask me tracks? I'm not going to do tracks. I can do artists.
Okay. Look at the artists. All right. But then you got to name one track. You got to name your favorite. Yes.
I'm not doing it.
Right. Because I'm asking you this because I already know what mine is.
Yeah,
but
of course. You thought about this on the plane going down and never thought about texting me to say I'm going to ask this question. But, okay, so I was terribly remiss. These are in no particular order, but I am going to start with Biggie because I was terribly remiss in not saying Biggie in Columbus. And I just think that entire first album is one of the most brilliant hip-hop pieces of all time. I don't know, when you, give me the loot is just come on, what gets better than that? And
the skits, which are just funny as hell.
The skits are the funny as hell. And then I have a kind of like, there's a tension for me between Lauren and Little Kim for different reasons. I don't love a lot of what Kim says, but I think that when Kim relies on her real storytelling abilities, and she has mad bars, like she can spit, there's no question about that. She has a really great, really interesting perspective on what it meant to be a young girl growing up in Brooklyn, kicked out of your house at 16 years old, and basically kind of surviving through the graces of like your relationship with drug dealers. I think that when she allows herself to tell that story, pretty much nobody tells it better than she does. Eric, Rakim, the God, I mean, there would be none of, we owe present day, and forget present day MCs, that entire generation of MCs that came after him allow that permission to be lyrical and fluid and to have an MC play with rhythm the way that they do. They owe that to
raise the bar.
Yeah, he just raised the bar. Then who else did I say? Jay-Z. And see, now I gotta take somebody out.
Because you put Biggie in.
Because I put Biggie in. Favorite, who do I just, oh no, there are three people competing. Okay, I know that, okay. And then it's Tip, it's A Tribe Called Quest. Only because if he hears that I didn't put him in there, he'll like give me shit about it for days, so.
See, that's the other problem with being close friends with a working journalist. It's like the story, well, that time I was hanging out with Biggie. Like she told this great story. I don't know whether she wants to repeat about, when she first met Biggie and how Biggie referred to her. Every time he would ask somebody how she was doing, right? So she got all these kinds of stories. Favorite song?
So Biggie could never remember my name, but he thought I was fine, and so he would call me that Angela Bassett looking. But like, but really, not like how's Joan? Like, you mean Joan? Nah, she's a Gemini. She work up at the Vibe. You know the Angela Bassett look. Like,
that'd be a nice thing to put on your tombstone. 50 years from now. And the song? And the song?
What song?
The one song.
I'm not doing the songs, Mark.
Tower Records, Desert Island Disc.
I'm not doing it.
Okay, so I'll start with Rakim. And, y'all like lost your mind when Kendrick did that Control verse. Anybody over the age of 40 was like, yeah, whatever, right? Because we had heard Rakim talk about them 7 MCs and murdered 21 MCs in a line. Take 7 MCs, put them in a line. Take 7 more brothers who think they can rhyme. It'll take 7 more before I go for mine. That's 21 MCs ate up at the same time. And all 21 of them knew who he was talking about. He didn't have to name their names. They all knew they just got bodied. Right? That's what we're talking about, right? So and his willingness to imagine, right? When you listen to stuff like The Ghetto, it's like, and this is a dude, like when he first hits, I mean, this is stuff he had written when he was 14 years old.
Right.
Just like, I'm a thinker, right? And then they had all that 5% up in there, and it's like, right, because that's the other element for us growing up with hip hop in New York. The stuff that we were hearing from Rakim and Brand Nubian and Poor Righteous Teachers, we gone to high school with 5%ers, right? We had to embrace and be part of that discourse just to be able to like get from class A to class B, right? Because some dude would stop you. Well, maybe not you at Philston, but me at Brooklyn Tech, some dude's gonna stop you. What's up, God? Okay. So Rakim, I gotta put Jay in there. A, because he's a Sag, right? Which I am. December 4th, 69. I'm December 2nd, 1965. I'll be 50 this year too. And just to be quite honest, right? Dude, swag. You see what Jay looks like, right? Dude, swag, right? To be able to pull that off, it's like, you listen to some Jay-Z, it's like, oh, hell, I can do this, right? So that's part of it, right? Again, the New York piece, I'm Pharoah Monch. And I know Monch don't get much play in the South. but I love myself some Pharoah Monch, and particularly these days, because so many of his projects, you know, he produces a kind of visual to it, right? Because he's almost as committed these days to making sure there's this amazing visual representation. Yeah, so when you see, you know, the 10-minute video that was directed by Terrence Nance, you know, for his song Clap, you know, which in 2010 basically captured everything that's going on in Black Lives Matter, you know, from the standpoint, you know, of a black police officer, Benga, you know, and having to work through what does that mean to deal with police violence for someone who's actually part of the community and when the community decides to clap back. So I got Monch, I got Jay, I got Rakim. I've always loved MC Light's voice. Just, there's a kind of warmness about her voice that you heard, you know, first time I heard Paper Thin in 1988, you know, having the chance to even meet her and listen to her talk. In fact, she's speaking at Duke this afternoon. I won't be there, unfortunately. So I got one more. Yeah.
The last one is always
The last one is a hard one. And so I'm torn between Cube and LL. And I don't particularly like LL. And you said Biggie, so I don't have to put Biggie in the mix. I don't particularly like LA, but the longevity and the storytelling, right? You know, LL could tell stories, right? Which is why I would never include Tupac in any of these lists. You know, he wasn't a great storyteller. He was an okay lyricist. His flow was right? With Tupac, it was all the other stuff, right? The charisma and all that kind of, which is why.
Eyelashes.
Yeah, eyelashes. You know, and folks don't get this, but, you know, had Tupac lived, he would have been Brad Pitt. Right. But, you know, we don't get a chance to see that. So I'm going to take Cube, all right? Because I just, you know, the storytelling piece and what Cube's become, you know, for those of us who grew up and first saw Cube, not just with a Jerry curl, but a bad Jerry curl, right? You know, and like even in some place like Albany, Georgia, I'm sure there's some of you in the room that don't know nothing about a Jerry curl. And all of them NWA cats had some nasty, right? Except for DJ Yella, right? And like Ren, but like, you know, Eazy-E and Cube and even, you know, that the World Class Wrecking Crew with just nasty ass Jerry curls. But you would have never expected him to have the sensibility, right, to transform into what he's become. Right, you know, that he created two singular movie brands, you know, Barbershop, right, and the family friendly fare, you know, like, are we going there? You would have never imagined that.
And here's the thing about Cube. I mean, because at this point, I think I've done that article and 3 cover stories on him. One was like in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in an exhibit here in Ohio, in Cleveland. He always knew that he wanted to be a director. Yeah. He always thought that part of the reason that he's such a good at MC is because he thinks visually first. And he was like already making moves in that direction by 95. So to other people, it would definitely seem surprising, and I understand that. But he was always very clear and focused about, and so that's the other thing that I think gets lost, is that when people saw like, oh, Will Smith can be an actor. It's like people understood I could get in with this hip hop thing, but it also allows me to build these other avenues and brands that actually become quite viable and powerful.
I mean, when you think about all of them, you know, and they're almost all of the same generation, right? When you think about Latifah, when you think about Ice Cube, Ice-T, Will Smith, you know, Most comes along because a lot of folks knew of Most before he was Most. You know, he was Dante, you know, doing Cosby Mysteries. All right, you know, so he had already been committed to, you know, so when you see him in 16 Blocks, it's like, you know, that wasn't something that was brand new. Right? If you see Busta Rhymes in Finding Forrester, right, and part of it is that, you know, hip hop was always such a visual platform. Right, both from the lyrical standpoint, but clearly when they had the chance to actually produce music videos. You mentioned Cube. You know, Cube's first directorial gig was directing a video for Color Me Bad.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So we take some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
You guys have anything you want to ask us?
since you are all about asking what her favorite track is, I'm kind of curious as to what your favorite track is.
Pete Rock and CL Smooth, to reminisce over you.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I am still here like, please talk more, tell more stories for us. And I am part of the first generation of hip hop in Brazil. Like, I grew up exactly like you were saying, when hip hop was a block thing. And listen, hip hop was to watch a car pass by with rap music and a loud sound. And my question for you guys is how to keep in love with hip hop and to fight for hip hop, even with all this misogyny, sexism, as you have been doing. How, I am 33 years old now, and I know it's a new generation, but I think hip hop has so much to give to young folks nowadays, and it's not explored as it should be. How to keep in love with hip hop and how to show hip hop to the new generation that are coming. Thank you.
One of the things that actually really helped me to stay engaged was to travel and to see how hip hop moves globally. So at one of my most disillusioned moments with hip hop, because you go through these kind of grown up life changes that sort of make you realize, like, okay, first it was like, how can I be a feminist and defend hip hop? Like, around 2000, 2001, I'm a new mother, and I have to make a real decision about how much of this I'm actually going to allow my child to be exposed to. And, the commercialism of the music makes it difficult, but traveling, like going to Cuba for the first time, actually, and seeing how hip-hop moved in Alamar was so similar to how I had experienced it in the South Bronx, and understanding that the narrative we have for hip-hop in the United States is one thing, but how it is actually functions as a form of resistance in non-US context is actually quite powerful. So that was really important for me. Secondly, I just, for me, giving up on hip hop, even with all the misogyny, because I experienced hip hop as a culture, in some ways meant writing off the redemptive power of young men of color. And I felt as my job as a feminist was to make sure that I understood that feminism isn't just about bringing about changes, empowering changes for women. It's really about bettering humanity, because feminism makes the world a better place. There are ways that hip-hop taught me to look at the ways that masculinity is particularly oppressive to men, and the formations of their own identity. What does it mean to not be allowed a wide range of expression, not be allowed vulnerability, to be tied to these tropes, both privately and publicly, of hyper-masculinity? Like, that's just a very heavy burden. So I always say that hip-hop made me a better feminist, and I believe that it did, but it was also just kind of digging my heels in on those more difficult moments, and then having to redefine my connection and purpose to it.
Hello. I have a question. It's kind of off topic, but so based off the elevation of sexual exploitation in derogatory terms in current rap music, do you think that it could have been prevented if, like, early hip hop female artists did not take advantage of their sexual freedoms in music?
No. So here's the interesting thing, right? At this point, I think that if we did a chart for misogyny in hip hop and we lined it up and we did it by years, this era of the new millennium era would probably register as perhaps the most misogynist, right? It's also the era that has the least amount of female, commercial female MCs. So I think that there was nothing wrong with, there was really nothing wrong with rappers who were female rappers who were sexually explicit. There was certainly a critique to be made of them, as there is to be made of all rappers, but they existed alongside. I mean, you had Salt and Pepper, you had MC Lyte, you had Queen Latifah, you had The Brat, you had Foxy, you had Kim. You had a wide range of female voices that all make up the mix. Are you guys listening to Jasmine Sullivan's? Right? So like the brilliance of like Jasmine Sullivan, right, is that they're all of these different black female voices that are contributing to a discourse of what black womanhood is. That's what that moment was like in hip hop. To me, what you see right now is the more flagrant misogyny is that you just took away the voices. You took away all the counterexamples and then kind of complain like, and then put the burden of representation on one or two. And quite frankly, I mean, I love Nicki as when her bars are tight, they are bars. I mean, they are some serious bars. But Nicki as solely an MC, I'm not convinced about that. She really does sort of live also in this world as a mega pop star. And there's no critique of that, but to have her carry the mantle for black women in hip hop is a lot.
I super agree. No. Hi, I just first want to say thank you. I super love you, Joan Morgan. And so much so that I snatched my 16-year-old daughter out of school today and we drove here from Atlanta so we could see you.
Thank you.
And I love what you bring, the critical thinking that you bring to hip hop. I want to thank you for the segment that I caught about you talking about the curation, like what your son brings. I have a 25-year-old son, too, who does that for me. Mm-hmm. And I've been in the music industry for about over 2 decades now. So it's interesting to see the differences. And so what you just healed for me is the conversation around how it grew up as a lifestyle for us, a culture for us, and how it's literally just a genre for them. So I walk in the house the other day and I'm like, truffle butter, really? You're like, we all going there with music, with lyrics and stuff now, and the kids are like, get over it. It's just a passing thing for us. But I guess because I lived hip hop so much, like I lived in the lyrics and the words, when I hear stuff like that, I'm freaking out because I don't want my kids to be living that kind of stuff. So you just helped me kind of get over that. And my question is, though, in this moment, is there a level of social responsibility, not censorship, given the creative freedom as people want to have it, but is there a social responsibility in terms of how it's delivered to the masses? Because I have young goddaughters, for instance. I think it was 12 when they came and educated me on what watermelon seed was and all this other stuff, and that freaks me out. Is there a social responsibility in terms of how you can say what you want to say, but I respected Luke. I'm a freak. I'm a child of Freaknik. And I respected Luke because I had to stay up for BET After Dark in order to get that. And it was something that I wanted, so I did it. But I can get up and go to just traveling here, leaving Atlanta at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. You're inundated with it everywhere you go. So is there a level of social responsibility that we could advocate for so that it's just dished out in a way that there's not so much collateral damage?
So this is the kind of question that always gives me reason for pause, for a couple of reasons. You mentioned Luke, and I wonder, would we have wanted that level of responsibility from Millie Jackson? Would we have wanted that level of responsibility from Dolomite? Red Fox, not the Red Fox that you saw in Sanford and Son, but Red Fox who did the albums. Would we want that level of responsibility for Jelly Roll Morton and a song like "Go Get Me a Pallet"? which I'll be quite honest with you, would make Lil Wayne blush if Lil Wayne heard the lyrics to it. The point that you make about being inundated with it, you know, rappers have virtually no control on getting their music played on multinational radio stations. And Joan and I have been having this argument for 10 years. Also, you know, we know there are now different platforms, right? So stuff can get loaded up to YouTube and things of that nature. But there's a larger system in place that the rappers themselves largely don't have any control over. You know, in the absence of these other infrastructures, you know, these are just dudes saying stupid in their bedroom that no one else hears. And so while it's important to hold the artists themselves accountable, we also have to hold these structures accountable. And quite honestly, it's easier to complain about irresponsible artists than it actually is to do the kind of organizing that it takes to hold these larger structures accountable.
And so you literally just answered my question, because when I ask about social responsibility, it's really not about the artists. That's why I say let's not censor them. It is about the system and the media outlets that perpetuate the messages. It's like the ratings, the whole GPG, rated R, triple X thing is just out the window. Everything is as is everywhere all day long. And so is there a social responsibility to kind of lead things in the direction that it's appropriate for?
You know, what's really interesting, though, that I think, thank you for your question. I think that one of the things that is interesting to me, particularly as the mother also of a 16-year-old, but also knowing Kathy Cohen's work, who's a political science, who's very invested in how is hip hop actually impacting our youth? And I think what is interesting to me is that by and large today, there are far fewer kids who feel like hip hop informs them in the way that I did when I was a kid. Kids make a decision to not deal with lyrical content that they don't want to deal with all the time. I think that hip hop has fewer fans as young people than, let's say, maybe 10, 15 even years ago. And I think that we often assume that hip hop is impacting young people and not assuming that they're making critical decisions and choices about what they listen to. And that also they have a wide range of options in terms of entertainment. I didn't have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and 100 channels on cable. I had the park. And so what was happening in the park, which was MCs and 2 turntables, was really important to me. But kids today have a lot of different choices, and they don't all invest. They very rarely do they all invest them in hip hop.
Good. Thank the both of you. We're going to close the question and answer session. We want to give Dr. Mark Anthony Neal and Joan Morgan a hand for coming out and giving us the time. Now, if you didn't notice, what they were doing was very hip-hop. They were telling stories from the past. This is the basis of hip-hop. They were talking about history, and that's our theme and point here. Now, what we will allow, lunch goes from now until 1. So if you have books that you want them to sign, if you want to come up and just, shake their hands and thank them, you can do that. There are students that are here that will tell you. We have those that are guests. We have a Chick-fil-A on campus. We have a Einstein on campus. There's a Pizza Hut. There's a Subway. They will direct you in the direction of those. So if you have books you want to sign, come up and meet the actual scholars themselves.